you can meet us in Esther chapter 7, verse 10. Esther chapter 7, verse 10, that's where we're going to pick up this morning, and that'll get us going in our class. A little overview of... That was good and loud. As you've noticed, we've been having issues, and hopefully that won't plague us all day. And if it does, I'll just make y'all come up here and we'll turn it off, so we'll see what happens. Esther chapter 7, verse 10. Just read that verse with me. This will give us the whole overview of what's happened. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. I think that sums up the majority of this book, doesn't it? Bad decisions. Bad decisions on the part of Haman. I would suggest to a degree bad decisions on the part of the king, wouldn't you? What about God's people? Can God's people afford bad decisions? Could Mordecai afford a bad decision? Or Esther? Could she afford a bad decision? The answer is no, I believe. Haman led his life, and it led him to the gallows that he built. All he was concerned about was revenge. All the king was concerned about was whether he was getting what he wanted. And now he's losing his so-called trusted servants. But God's people had a resolve. They faced their extinction. They faced their death. And they stood with God. Yes. That's right. That's right. When we often ask that question, why do bad things happen to good people? And what we're asking is, why do good things happen to bad people? We just don't want to say it the reverse way, because that makes us feel bad when we ask it that way.
We can't afford a bad decision, but possibly we can correct that.
That's very much true. Did Haman ever have the opportunity to tear that gallows down? This is the answer. He did. He did. And I believe verse 7, as it just brings about the idea of his punishment, it was the gallows that he had... Hold it together, y'all. It was the gallows that he had built for who? Mordecai. That's all he could see was another man's death. Now, I do want us to mention this. I don't know that we mentioned this last week, but there does not seem to be any... Is that driving y'all crazy? No, they're not doing this. I promise you this is not them. This is some kind of electrical gremlin that we have. Is this driving y'all crazy? All right. Let's try that one. I don't know if I can teach class from here, but we'll find out. Okay. Where was I? Oh, there does not seem to be any delay in the time that the king said, hang him, and when he was hanged. Did you notice that in the end of Esther chapter 7? This whole plot is revealed in this great dinner party at the mind of Esther, where she literally, standing before the presence of the king and standing before Haman, said, there's the man. There wasn't much time between the time Haman was begging for his life and the time that his life was ended. Now pick up with me in chapter 8. Let's see some things that happen here. Here's the king again. Esther chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king for Esther had told him, or had told what he was unto her. And the king took off his ring which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. What's taking place? Think about that for a minute. What's taking place? God's plan is taking place. I think that's a perfect illustration. What else is taking place? Think about it. Do what? A change in authority. That's a definite thing that's taking place. But what else is taking place? The righteous are being exalted, aren't they? The righteous are being exalted. Here, Mordecai. Esther chapter 7, verse 10, he was the man that was supposed to die. They took the ring from Haman's hand, who was dead. I don't want to be flippant with that. But they took his position from him and they gave it to Haman. Faithful service is always rewarded. Now, faithful service is not always rewarded on this earth, is it? No. And sometimes I believe we read things like Esther chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, and we see the context of Esther chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, Esther chapter 1 through 7. And we tell ourselves in our lives that if we do good for God, God will do good for us here. But is that always true? Is that a guarantee? No. Here the queen had told the king who Mordecai was to her. Now I think that's very important, isn't it? I think that shows us the importance of our relationships on this earth, isn't it? And I think it shows us the value of being who we're supposed to be. Who was Mordecai to Esther? Relative. But who was she? Or who was he, sorry. Who was he? He was the one that raised her, remember? They had this close relationship. And she was listening to him. He was looking out for her. They were doing what they were supposed to. And I find that to be something that we need to pay attention to here. Now pick up with me in verses 3 through 6, because Esther is going to beseech the king on behalf of God's people, the Jews. Verse 3, and Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device which he had devised against the Jews. Once more, Esther here is before the king, and look at her here. How does she approach the king? I think the first thing that we see is that she's bowed down before him. She's begging him. Now, that does not mean she's giving him worship. But she's bowed down before him. She's begging him in his presence. What does that tell us about her? She was humble. I think that's a characteristic that should shine forth from Esther's life, isn't it? She didn't want the limelight, did she? But here she is in it. I think that's one of the major lessons here. She respected authority. Who was she? She was the queen. But how did she approach the king? As a servant. And I think many times we want to be the queen, and we want to tell the king what to do, don't we? She respected authority. One of our greatest problems in this country, I believe, is a lack of respect of authority. You can see it in our school system. And that's not to say the school system's at blame there. Their hands are tied, aren't they? When's the last time a school paddled a child? Well, I can tell you when I was in school, they still did. If you were late to your class, you know what you got? If you were late 6 times a day, you got 6. Let's put it that way. You can figure that out. We lack authority. But I think one of the bigger problems that we have in our society is we lack responsibility and we lack a respect of authority toward God. Now, I don't want to make this application at all and make you think this. The king here was not a god, but she reverenced him as a king. Now, you make this illustration in your mind. Who is our king? And how many times do we try to be the queen that tells him what to do? That is a sobering thought. And here she comes before him. And read this. She comes in his presence, she falls at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away this mischief. She had no problem expressing her feelings. Yes. No. No, it turns out reverse on Haman. We don't talk about emotions very often, do we? You ever heard a sermon on emotions? Well, let me write this down right here. I've never preached one either. Do we have emotions? And everybody can have a different one. Would this not bring us to tears? Haman's dead, but the law is still in effect. She comes before him in tears. That also tells me one of the reasons why I believe she's a humble person. She wasn't afraid to beg for her life or her people's life. Look at verse 4. Now, this is impressive. This tells us the scene of what Esther has done. We don't see that in verse 3. Verse 4, then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. What has she done again? She fell down at his feet again, which we saw earlier, but she went into the king's room without being summoned, remember? She has risked her life again for who? Her people, the Jews. Let's ask this question. Would we risk our lives for our people? I know that's a hypothetical. I know you can't answer that, neither can I. We'd like to say yes, but we don't know. I think we can get some illustrations of this, can't we? Do we look out for one another in regular everyday life? That's a yes or no we can answer. Are we concerned about each other spiritually? That's a yes or no answer. I think we can answer those questions. But she comes before the king, and the king brings her in. And then you'll see the rest of verse 4. So Esther arose and stood before the king. I don't exactly know what she said in verse 3, but she was begging that this mischief be taken away, and all of these things are happening, and now she's standing before the king. And verse 5, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of, and you'll see the names here, which he wrote to destroy the Jews, which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Okay, now answer this. First part of her request, have I found favor in your sight? Second part of her request, how can I watch my people die? That's right. That's right. That's her first plea. if it pleased the king, number one, if I have found favor in his sight, number two, if this thing seems right, number three, and if I be pleasing in his eyes. 3 out of her 4 opening statements were about winning his heart. I think that should tell us something about the way we live, doesn't it? We should win the heart of our community. Are we those people that have to always be right? I think more times than not, the answer is yes. If we're honest. Someone recently said about the Lord's church, and I quote, in this community, they're brainwashing her. What does that say? Perception, isn't it? Whether we like it or not, life is about perception. How are we viewed as the Lord's people? It's a good question. How was Esther viewed? She had the heart of the king. She had the heart of those that were around her. She had the heart of Mordecai, didn't she? Remember, she won the heart of the man who was over all the king's search of a new queen. She was a heart winner. Makes a difference, doesn't it? And what that tells us, and what Esther's telling us, the way we live is going to be noticed. And our end goal is going to be, what was the end goal of Esther? Was it to save her life? No. It's to save her people's life. She knew about the law of the Medes and Persians, so she knew how difficult this was, and so did the king. So she begs here in this particular scene. And I want you to notice verse 6. I think this is the key. I think this is the key to the book of Esther. Why was Esther chosen to be queen? What did Mordecai do in his instillment in raising Esther? What was Esther's outlook on life? It's in verse 6. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people? Now don't read the rest. We'll catch that in just a minute. Number 1, Esther understood the difference between good and evil. Simple terms here. She was raised that way. That didn't happen in the king's house. We've already seen the king's view of good and evil, and he doesn't have one. He only sees evil, as long as it's good for him. That didn't happen in the king's house. That happened in the raisin's house. But number 2, Esther understood the value of a belonging. Who were her people? The Jews, God's people. And she could not stand to see them hurting. What do we do when our people are hurting? When our people are pleading? Look at the rest of verse 6. How can I endure to see destruction of my kindred? It's not just to see evil come upon her people. She says, how can I endure? How can I survive? And here's the reality of what she's asking. I can't. How can I see my kindred die? That's right. She does. And I think she also shows us something that we need to make application to. Now, I know Esther's talking about physical life here, and I think you do too. But let's make the application to us spiritually. How can we stand to watch our fellow kindred die? Spiritually. Is there a spiritual death? What brings about spiritual death? That's definitely the end result of that, isn't it? And how can we sit and see the kindred of humanity die spiritually? Wouldn't we say humanity is our people? We don't have any other people to claim. There's number one, the humanity of people. But there's number two, a second idea of spiritual death. How can we stand to watch our fellow Christians die? Can a Christian be lost? We better come to grips with that. I'll say it the way I think John D. Berry would say it. How can we sit on pews of comfort knowing our fellow Christians are lost? That's a tough question. She says, how can I sit back and do nothing? So she barges in to her death. But the king's heart was with her. Now look at verses 7 and 8. Then the king, Ahasuerus, said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman. And him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hands upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews as it liketh you, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring, for the writing which is in the king's name, and sealed with the king's ring, may no man reverse. What does the king say? Well, in typical king fashion, do what's best for you. I would love to say that there's some honor in this statement. I think there is a degree of honor in this, because who does the king love? Esther. Who does the king respect? Mordecai. But I hate to be a labeler, but I'm going to for just a minute. The king was a pushover. Once again, just write whatever you like. Did you notice that in the middle of verse 7 and 8? Write ye also for the Jews as it liketh you. Just sign my name to whatever you need to. He was a pushover when it came to destroying them, and he's a pushover when it comes to saving them. That can't be us. Wishy-washy is what we would call it. Indecisive. And the document Mordecai is asked to create will be irreversible. In verse 9, then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month of Sivan, in 3 and 20th day thereof, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews and to the lieutenants and to the deputies and the rulers of the province, which are from India unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, unto every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. Well, we're back to the impressiveness of this kingdom, aren't we? Copies of the writing were going to be produced and sent to all 127 provinces or districts or land areas of the empire, which extended from India to Ethiopia, interestingly enough. He was global. He was global. Now look at verse 10. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by post on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and other animals. The plan was written in every language, in every tongue, and sent out in every direction on everything that they had. What was the news? What was the news? Don't kill the Jews. You pick up in verse 11, wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people, and the province that would assault them. Great, it's happening up here too. It could be me. You are very right. Very right. Let me find where I was at. Here we go. To cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones, women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey upon one day in all the province of King Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, the copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published to all the people, that the Jews should be ready against that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. What has Mordecai written? What's the idea of this law, this new decree that comes from the king? You notice that again, it came from the king, beginning in verse 11. Who wrote it? Mordecai. He sealed it with the king's ring. What's the idea? Haman's law was on this date, kill the Jews. All the people are going to band together. This is the law. Second law. Jews better get ready, because they have full authority of the king to destroy anyone who tries to destroy them. That's right. I believe this is evidently the providence of God. That's right. In the eyes of the king, and I often wonder sometimes, was the king saying, you write what you need to because I don't know how to fix this? I've often wondered if that's what he was saying to Mordecai. I don't know. It seems it could be possible. But all these laws are irreversible. How are they going to do it? Well, they had to survive on this day. And if they did, they survived. And if they didn't according to the law. It had been about 2 months, scholars say, from the time the original law was written to the time we're reading about now that this new proclamation is going back out. Short amount of time. Verse 14, so the post that rode upon the mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed on the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan the palace. The plan was adopted, it was decreed, and it was sealed with the king's ring, and then it was immediately, I love the scenes of this, the post was pressed. This was called overnight delivery, as good as it could be in that day. They pressed as hard as they could to get this news throughout the entire kingdom. It seems to us, and I think this is very important to note, God's people were scattered over this empire. Otherwise, they wouldn't have sent it to every place, would they? 127 provinces, where are God's people? 127 provinces, it seems to be. This had to take place. I always caution us when talking about providence. I think it's easy for us to read the book of Esther and see providence, God working through the natural order of man to do things that are impossible in the schemes of man. I always caution us to this degree. Let's not call things providence in our lives until we're sure. I think sometimes we're quick to say that was the providence of God. I think we can look at the entire account and see the providence of God. But I would highly question if Esther or Mordecai looked at their lives and thought at that moment, thank goodness for the providence of God. Because when we do that in our lives, we weaken the providence of God in our eyes. Because what happens when providence doesn't work? What happens when we think something should have been different and God didn't do it? We weaken our view of providence. I think there's no denying here in looking at the history of all of these people and what has happened and what brought them here and where they're at now, that here was God in the midst of them. In a book where his name is never mentioned by pen, but his actions certainly are described. The book of Esther is not just a book about what happened to God's people. That's how we usually look at it, isn't it? What's going to happen to Esther? What about Mordecai? Where are God's people? They're in captivity. What was the real event in the book of Esther? God once again saving his people. How many times in the Old Testament Does God save His people? I'll respond this way: every time. Every time. Yes, and I think that's apt to be said. But what I'm saying is, let's not call something providence unless we are sure. I think we weaken it because sometimes we'll say that certain things are providence. And I ask you this. I'm certainly not calling anyone into question. I don't have a problem with anything anybody does. Are we sure about that? Are we sure? That was my next question. How do you know that? Here we can see things happening that should have never taken place, but they did. Should Esther have become queen? No. There was a purpose there. Should Mordecai have overheard the plot to kill the king? Probably not. Should Mordecai have ever been given the king's ring to fix a decree that was against him? Odds were against them. And I do want us to note this. How often in Scripture, when we see the providence of God, do we see it in large areas that affect great numbers of people and not just individuals? I think sometimes we have in our minds, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we think providence is the little things in life. Just a thought. Just a thought. Here's verse 15. Mordecai goes out from the presence of the king's royal apparel of blue and white and a great crown of gold with a garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. Mordecai's advancement in the empire was brought about by a royal decree, I would say. I would suggest that Mordecai didn't put these clothes on his own decision. Kingly-like apparel. It's what Haman would have wore. Now all of a sudden, Haman, the destroyer of people, has been replaced by Mordecai, the voice of the helpless. So they put him in this presence of this. And even the Gentiles of Shushan rejoiced in that event. I find that to be the most impressive scene right here. The entire city is rejoicing because who is now in the place of Haman? Mordecai. Would we rejoice if a Christian became the president? We would. Let me ask you this. Would the people of this country? I think to a degree probably not, because what do we see on the news? What's the news say? The news is trying to say this country is not a Christian nation. Do we have to believe the news? I still believe this country is a Christian nation. They don't want it to be. And the squeaky wheel always gets greased, doesn't it? And the minority is usually the loudest voice, isn't it? Now, I use the phrase Christian nation very loosely, and I hope you understand that. But we can be a people who raise up a generation of which will change this country. That's what Mordecai was. He raised Esther, and she changed, listen to the way I'm going to say this, she changed our lives. How did she change our lives? What would have happened if she failed? No Christ. No Christ. Also a scene of providence. And the people here rejoiced and were glad. Verse 16 and 17, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor in every province, in every city. Wheresoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. How interesting is that? God's people are triumphant in the face of destruction. It's interesting to me that many of those in this kingdom of which would have worshiped false gods now want to worship the one true and living God. Because what do they recognize? This can't be. How did these things take place? I love this scenes as well in chapter 8. Look at the beginning of verse 16. The Jews had light. What is described as light in the New Testament? Light and darkness is contrasted. What's the scenes of that? Good and evil. Good was brought into their life. They had gladness and joy and honor. Wouldn't you be excited to see that in your life? To see light, good, to see gladness and honor and joy. It can be, can it? How does the Christian have joy? Contemplate that for a minute. How does the Christian have joy? How does the Christian recognize light in his life, gladness and honor? What's the scenes of this? What's the scenes of this joy, this gladness, this honor? They were going to be dead, but they're not now. Same is true for you and me, aren't we? We should be the receivers of our own punishment, but we're not. Chapter 8 ends in a way that I think is fantastic, and I hope you'll be ready next week to study chapter 9 and continue out in this book, and we'll finish it soon. A lot left to happen in this book, a lot left to go on. Hopefully soon we'll have our audio issue fixed, and maybe we won't be enduring this much longer. I know my brain can't handle it much more, so we'll figure it out, I promise.